This is your commissioner, Patrick Wheelton, owner and fantasy manager of the Calypso Blue Crabs, here in Week 14, the end of the regular season. I couldn't get out of the season unscathed. I'm here to take on my punishment for being the lowest scorer in Week 14. Fantasy playoffs for me next week. Second seed, taking on Brian Morgan. I hope to score a few more points than I did the 82.6 that has me here with what I'm calling the hose of fantasy football woes in Week 14. This video brought to you by Miller Lite. It's been about a decade since I've done one of these. This is the upgraded deluxe model with the handle on it. Good luck in Week 15.
You are listening to the Beltway Wars Invitational podcast with your hosts Adam Jackson and Patrick Wheelton. Enjoy the show.
Back to the Week 14 recap show for the Beltway Wars Invitational podcasts with your hosts Adam Jackson and Patrick Wheelton. As always, the show to close out our regular season coverage and to look at some playoff matchups, the teams that made it, and also look at the teams that did not make it and kind of see what went wrong, what went right for the teams that did make it. So this is going to be a little bit different of a show. We're not going to really dwell too much on the Week 14 results. Mainly, we're just going to be looking at, the people that made it and how their matchup really affected their playoff outcome. So with that, Patrick, anything, because I love to ask this question, and you didn't even think of anything. Anything for Week 14 that you found interesting?
Interesting, just upsetting that more quarterbacks got hurt, and I know that hits you hard in this one. Just you've got a bye coming up, which is nice. You'll get to kind of think on that for a week or so, but you'll be without Herbert, and a couple other starting quarterbacks got hurt again this week, and I feel like there are more backups playing in the NFL right now than there are like starters coming into the season. So I can't quite remember. We're used to running back injuries. I don't remember a season where we're this used to this many quarterbacks getting hurt throughout the course of the season. So it'll make for some really interesting jockeying around in terms of playoff starts and sits, and defensive starts and sits, as we've talked about previously. But other than that, no. I really thought I was going to get through the year without having to partake, and that didn't work out for me. But hopefully that's out of my system, and we'll see what happens as we move into the fantasy playoffs.
Yep, you have paid your shotgun dues, so hopefully just good vibes going forward for your squad.
Was it okay that I switched it up? I wasn't digging the shotgun thing. Like, I literally bought
We've had people literally just drink a beer, so
that's true.
I wouldn't really worry about the method.
I literally did buy that like 4 weeks ago, like in anticipation of this potentially happening, so that I would be prepared if it did.
Bad. So. That's just bad. That's just asking for to get
I'm
last
asking
place.
for it. Yeah.
But that definitely happened. But let's get started here. We're going to do just a short recap of the scores here in terms of what they meant. So let's just get started with Josh here. Now 6-8 does not make the fantasy football playoffs, but does put up the high score this week, 136.42. I don't know. Give him a cheering sound for not having a great season, but puts up the high score this week to end out his regular season. Just with his squad, just looking down the board, in terms of draft strategies and how this season went wrong. Austin Eckler really wasn't looking the same as he has been in the past. Ends the regular season as running back 24. Definitely not the player that you drafted him as in the first round. So that's definitely a disappointment for Josh, and one of the reasons why he is 6-8 on the season. And the other one is probably Garrett Wilson, with Aaron Rodgers going out in the first few plays of this season. He only ranked wide receiver 24, which is very good, but I think a lot of us were expecting a top 10 wide receiver performance this year out of Garrett Wilson, and just not the case with Zach Wilson at the helm there in New York. So those two players really stick out to me of players that really disappointed for Josh, and is probably the reason why he's not in the fantasy football playoffs this year. But this week, just a couple things. One of the teams that you definitely mentioned, or one of the teams that was definitely really affected by quarterback injuries, Joe Burrow going out, has to stop Joshua Dobbs here. Only scores 5 points and is benched now. He is actually not starting this week. It will be Nick Mullins in Minnesota. And then the best player of his of this week was probably the Evan Ingram. 27 points, 11 for 12, 95 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now number 5 tight end on the season. Was drafted in the 7th round by Josh, so that was definitely a good pick for Josh. Definitely has proved himself as being picked that high for Josh. So at 6-8, he is out of the playoffs, but really closed out the season with a nice win over a playoff team.
Yeah, and it's really kind of fitting that he's got the most points this week, closing it out in style and in fashion, despite having the fewest points. He finishes 10th in the standings, but last in points scored with just 1439. That's about 42 points less than the next highest, which is our 12th place, Alex, the Owings Mills Orioles. By the way, I was thinking the other day, like we hardly ever refer to the team names. Like I feel like we should start doing that if we think about it. I can certainly do better. We have some good team names.
What a great thing to bring up at one of the last shows of the season. I appreciate that.
I know. Well, for next year, I don't know. I think we should try to do that. But you kind of hit on the main storylines, and I'm thinking about some of the guys you're talking about and looking at his draft board, and it's a story that we've talked about with his team before. His top 5 picks, just Austin Eckler, Garrett Wilson, Joe Burrow, Miles Sanders, Tyler Lockett, all guys that underperformed consistently throughout the year, and it's really hard to win. I mean, kudos to Josh. He was able to make some kind of savvy additions that kept his team kind of afloat. And the reason that he ends the season with a 6-8 record, it could have been a lot worse. He found guys like Chuba Hubbard, like Jaden Reed in recent weeks, and then drafting guys late. Evan Ingram, Adam Thielen was good for the first third of the season or so, maybe third to a half of the season. He was a 10th round pick. So Ingram was a 7th round pick. So got good production from those guys. Found some talent on the waiver wire. But just cannot make up for the lack of production at the top of the draft board.
Yeah, it's just a very disappointing season from winning it all last year to not even making the playoffs this year. Just a tough go of it. Some injuries, some just misses on the draft board. But I'm sure Josh will be itching to get to next season so that he can prove that he belongs in the fantasy football playoffs next year. So, but good on Josh for playing through the year and scoring the most points this week. But going over to Mike's team here, at 7-7, does make the playoffs. He is the number 5 seed, so it didn't even matter that he took a loss in this one. Just going through his board, the player that really did the most for him this week was DJ Moore. 6 for 10, 68 yards and a touchdown. Also gets a rushing touchdown on the day. But, the big question mark, and has been all year long, Justin Jefferson. Now remains limited, and he exited this game with a chest injury. Actually had to go to the hospital because of this chest injury. So he is questionable this week as well. Just when you get him back, he just goes right back on the shelf, and he remains to be seen if he's going to have him for the first round of the playoffs against, that would be Jake. So at 7-7, was one of the last teams to get in, but he does get in with a strong point total. Definitely a dangerous team. It just all comes back to health of Devin Achane, Justin Jefferson, and just looking at his board here, Etienne's questionable, Achane's questionable, Zay Jones questionable, DJ Moore questionable. So, it's kind of been the entire season here for Mike, and the injuries just creep up at the really wrong time.
Yeah, and this is not a week where you want all those questionable tags to your top 4 players: Etienne, Achane, Moore, Jefferson, even Brian Robinson, who missed his last game. He was on bye this previous week, but he's questionable. Didn't miss his last game. Did he? No, he was on bye in week 14, but he is questionable as well. So a whole host of questionable starters. Dalton Schultz, though, potentially returned to a full practice, so that is good news. So he will be inserted directly into the lineup again. But yeah, man, it's 7-7. Story of 2 different seasons for Mike. He got all those wins early, collected his wins early, and then weathered the storm through the injuries. Has a lot of talent. It's really, I would be really worried with all those questionable tags, guys missing practice in a pivotal week right now. The one guy who you can rely on consistently for Mike is Josh Allen. Sorry, Jared Allen is retired, but Josh Allen, the number 1 quarterback in fantasy sports. Did hear an interesting statistic today that on a points per game basis, the last time he's right about, I think it was 27.5 points per game. The last time that a number 1 quarterback finished with 27 or fewer fantasy points on a per game basis was 2014 Andrew Luck. So we're not used to this kind of general lower point totals per game for quarterbacks, but he does have the number 1 quarterback in fantasy. It's not what you typically expect in terms of like high point totals, but Allen is getting the job done. He gets 20 points this week, and Mike is moving on as the 5 seed.
Yeah, I mean, just the reasoning probably behind that is just all the turnovers. He's had an interception in each game since week 5. But he does offset that with the rushing touchdowns. I mean, he has 9 rushing touchdowns. So definitely turns the ball over a lot, but makes up with it with the rushing attack. And it doesn't really matter what your points per game basis is if you're the number 1 quarterback, because that means that everyone else is lower than that anyway. So it's kind of scalable in terms of that. But in terms of Mike, dangerous team, I will say. But just those injuries, man, you just got to be careful. Nothing you can really do about it, but really could end his fantasy season before he would like, especially with the maybe expectations and the amount of talent that he has on his squad.
One thing I think and I don't want to dwell too much because we have a lot to talk about tonight, but a theme of the show that we'll probably say this word a few times, this phrase, but is fantasy league winners. And Ezekiel Elliott, we should just point out, if there's any fantasy league winner that you pick up late in the season or a guy that pops at the end of the year, it's Ezekiel Elliott. With that injury to Ramondre Stevenson, he looks fantastic. Just 22 for 68 on the ground, but caught 7 passes for 72 yards and a touchdown. So Ezekiel Elliott finding the fountain of youth late in the season here for the Patriots. Terrible team in the Patriots, but he is clearly the workhorse right now for that team, and interesting guy to watch moving forward.
For sure. And I didn't give Mike a sound effect, so I'll give it to him now. He's made the playoffs at 7-7. Let's give him some claps there. But let's go over to our next matchup. The number 1 versus number 2 seed faced off in the last game of the regular season. I take home the victory, go to 13-1 with a 129.24.
The only thing I'm addicted to right now is winning.
And this one, and this week, obviously we talked about in the before we got talking about the matchups. Justin Herbert out for the year with a broken finger. Definitely don't like to see that because he would have been my starting quarterback throughout the playoffs. And Tyreek Hill also injured in this one. He did return to the game, which I was very happy about, but is limited, misses practice on Wednesday. So the bye week is definitely something very good for me. Maybe my players can get healthy here because I do have a couple that have some questionable tags. But yeah, Justin Herbert was out. Tyreek Hill got hurt in this one, but Raheem Mostert, who we've talked about a lot, continues just to score me fantasy points. 96 yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground, 22.5 points. So him and Achane are definitely viable fantasy options for their respective teams in the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, and so it's kind of interesting. We just talked about all the questionable tags for Mike's team. You've got that, and unlike Mike, this is new territory for you. You have generally stayed relatively healthy over the course of the season. You've unlike Josh, you've got great production out of your top 5 guys on your team. So really, the story for you has been the health of your team throughout the season. So it is interesting to see now that Tyreek Hill is questionable, and Deontay Johnson, Dalton Kincaid, Raheem Mostert, Ramondre Stevenson, who missed these last couple games. It will be interesting if Stevenson does end up playing, given what we just talked about with Ezekiel Elliott, how much trust you are able to put in Stevenson and whether he cracks your starting lineup. Again, depending on these injuries, he may have to if he plays. But you do have Mixon, you do have Kamara. Those 2 guys are locked in starters for you. Mixon had a really, really nice week involved in the passing game and on the ground. So, yeah, I mean, Herbert is the big storyline. You're going to be forced into Kyler Murray, who, I mean, looking back on it, that kind of midseason acquisition, a guy that you kind of stashed away on your bench as he was coming back to full health. He is suddenly going to be thrust into a starting role for a 13-1 team who is going to have a bye this week. But at the very least, having that bye is critical to these guys getting back to being fully healthy. So that is going to come into play in a big way as the playoffs begin.
Yep, but just to mention, because I'm always love talking about myself, 13 wins is the record for the regular season win totals, just so everyone is aware, so that when I lose in the first round of the playoffs, you all can make fun of me for that. But I'm the number 1 seed, so but let's go over to the number 2 seed, even with a loss.
Hold on. I have to make a response to that.
Okay.
And more so only because it reminded me. So I was telling you before, 6 of us actually, surprisingly, were at the Ravens game on Sunday and at the same tailgate. And we were chatting a little bit about playoff matchups, which, by the way, just incredible atmosphere to be at that game and chatting about these fantasy matchups, everyone facing each other. It was just a lot of fun chatting it up at the tailgate. But your team, of course, came up, and I forget who it was exactly who said, no, I don't want Adam to lose in his first playoff matchup. I want him to go to the championship and lose in the championship to take home yet another second place. So I really don't remember who it was, or else I would say it. But
you better figure that out.
I really forget. Forget. Drinks were had at the tailgate, and but no, it was very good friendly banter and a lot of interesting playoff scenarios that were taking place that day.
But let's go over to the number 2 seed, even with a loss. You scored the league low this week, so you did our wonderful shotgun beer bong video that we've all enjoyed here. But now you go to 8-6, still the 2nd seed with Dustin also losing behind you. just the positives and negatives from your team. Saquon Barkley looked good in a not so great matchup, but 20 carries, 86 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That offense is looking like they're starting to get things going a little bit with Tommy DeVito. He's looking to get more comfortable, which is just going to make Saquon Barkley that much better. So definitely coming around at the right time for you going into the fantasy playoffs. But one little concern that I do want to talk about is Tua Tagovailoa here. At the beginning of the season, was scoring a lot of points. Now QB 12 has scored less than 10 points in his 2 of his last 3 games. So just something that you're going to have to make a decision on, because Matthew Stafford is taking a time machine back to his better days here. 20-plus points in his last 3 matchups. So he's been playing out of his mind recently. Just something that you're going to need to think about in terms of your first round playoff matchup against Brian.
Yeah, look, I mean, I read the tea leaves on this midseason. We talked about it on the pod. That was kind of an acquisition once I kind of looked a little bit more closely at the playoff matchups for Tua Tagovailoa. And unfortunately, he started fading even before these playoff matchups are beginning. He's really had a string of bad games, including this Jets team that he'll play in the first week of the fantasy playoffs, a team that he played a month ago and had a 9-point game. It was a 9-point game this week for him. So we're going to get to the playoff preview, but I think I told you when I picked Stafford up, I said, if Tagovailoa starts fading, I think Stafford is the best opportunity on the waiver wire at the time to potentially get hot, and that's exactly what he's done. So it's really a no-brainer. This lineup's going to look a little bit different next week. Aaron Jones hopefully will be returning. He was my best shot to get out of the basement in this week's fantasy point total. He ends up being ruled out on Sunday. Having to give the start to Dontavian Wicks, who just got 3 points. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here. Nico Collins banged up in this one, status uncertain. So it could be a little bit different of a fantasy lineup in the next week, first week of the playoffs.
The last thing I'll say about this matchup is it is funny that my kicker goes off against you yet again, because that's been a regular theme here. So over the past couple of years, so I'm just glad that happened to you against me.
It's funny. Our minds are connected, because as this week was happening, as soon as I noticed that, I could not remember the name. It was the Vikings kicker. What was the name of the Vikings? Blair Walsh. It was like his first season. He kind of came out of nowhere, I think, and he had this massive, massive fantasy day against me, and it has stuck with me ever since. And this certainly brought back shades of that. So thank you for pointing that out.
But you are, even with the loss, you're the number 2 seed, so I'll give you a nice little clapping hands here. You're making the playoffs, number 2. But you do have a tough matchup against Brian as your first playoff matchup. But let's keep going here. Let's go to Sarah's team here. Sarah, 6-8, just like her husband, does not make the fantasy playoffs. I don't know, did she make it last year? I'm not sure, but doesn't make it this year. It's 6-8. Just looking at her squad, some of the things that I was kind of looking at. I would say probably the most disappointing player that she had was Chris Godwin. Not really that much involved with Tom Brady as he was, or with Baker Mayfield as he was with Tom Brady last year. Wide receiver number 39. Definitely one of the biggest disappointments for her in terms of production that she was expecting, that she did not get out of her fantasy football team. But I would say the biggest surprise, I would say, for her squad that really kept her in it was Jerome Ford. Getting him mid-season with Nick Chubb going out, who she also lost early this season. He's been pretty good for her, and almost got her back into the playoff mix. Was only 1 game back of making the playoffs. But this week she scores 125 points, which is a great total. Gets her total wins to 6 at the end of the year. This week, Justin Fields had a nice day, rushing touchdown, 223 yards, and a passing touchdown. And then Sam Laporta really kind of dropped a goose egg here. Only 3.7 points in a matchup where they were behind, so didn't get a lot of production out of a player that she's been used to getting production out of this year. So 6-8, not making the playoffs, but again, just like Josh, put up a nice showing in Week 14.
She did, and surprisingly enough, I mean, look, Sarah at 6-8, she outscored a lot of teams this year. She outscored Alex, Josh, Scott, Brian, was a couple points shy of number 6, Charlie. And, at the end of the day, this team that we keep talking about with Tom was only about 20 points shy of Tom's season point total. So really a nice year despite the adversity. She made moves that we talked about on the pod throughout the season to keep herself in contention. Drafting Sam Laporta as in the 14th round, one of the the last picks of the draft, one of the last tight ends taken in the draft. He's the number 4 tight end in fantasy, so like a great pick there. You mentioned Ford. You mentioned, you didn't mention Singletary, but that was a great kind of late season addition for her that was able to get some double-digit point games when Dameon Pierce started to struggle with some injury concerns. And look, she overcame like underperformers like Drake London, Chris Godwin, the injury, obviously the big injury to Nick Chubb. So like really good fantasy season, and not nothing to show for it here at the end, not making the playoffs, but like she should be really proud of the way that she kind of handled the adversity, kept at it, and finishes 6-8 with a really solid point total. So I love what Sarah did. I thought it was a masterclass in fantasy management throughout the year.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that losing your first round draft pick, it usually can throw your team into a tailspin, but she kept at it, and she was pretty close, as you mentioned, to make it into the playoffs. Just needed that win this week to probably get in. And it would have been, did she have more points than Brian? She did have more points than Brian, so if she would have tied with Brian, then she would have been the 7th seed and not Brian. But let's go over to Jake here. Jake makes the playoffs at 7-7, didn't need the win. He is now the 4th seed for the Beltway Wars Invitational playoffs. The 4th seed. Really came on. Was one of the weaker teams at the beginning of the season, but made a trade and put in some key players, started to produce that really drove him over the top. Just looking at this week for the top performer here, Rashad White, 25 carries, 102 yards, touchdown through the air. Really probably the most underrated running back in the league. Number 5 now, which I don't think anyone would really guess in terms of running backs. And then the low performer here, because I'll say it because I'm salty about it, but Mike Evans only gets 8 yards on this one. Better days ahead, of course. And his fantasy football playoff matchup is Green Bay, Jacksonville, and New Orleans. So I would say that's probably middle of the road. But in that offense, he's the number 1 guy. So he should see the ball early and often. But is the 7th seed. Didn't score a lot here, only 98 points, but doesn't matter. He will play Mike in the first round of the playoffs.
He will indeed. And the interesting thing to me is that, you mentioned the trade that you guys made kind of mid-season that involved some quarterbacks, Dak and Herbert, and Mike Evans was in that deal. And it is just curious and interesting that he is on your side of the bracket, Adam. So if Jake does get out of the first round, we are looking at kind of a potential interesting storyline in the second second round of
he'll be playing
playoffs,
2 players that I gave him, and I won't be playing any of the players that he gave me. So,
wow, yeah. So that really could be an interesting thing to watch there. But no, solid season for Jake. He cooled off this week relative to his fiery performances, electric really in the last handful of 5-6 weeks. He's really lit it on fire. From the fantasy point total perspective. And I mean, Mike Evans, wow, really concerning. 1 for 6 for 8 yards. Didn't really see any of this game. or figure out what wrong there for Evans in that matchup, but just a really frustrating afternoon for Mike Evans. Zach Moss doesn't do very much with 13 carries. But look, I mean, Jake is well positioned. I think he's got a lot of guys on this team, including Christian Watson, potentially coming back from injury, who was really lighting the world on fire before he got hurt. He's got Odell Beckham coming on at this point in the season, 10 targets for Beckham in this one. Jackson was off target on a lot of throws, but the targets really, it's so fun watching him, man. When he is hyped up, Beckham, like you just know that he is going to do everything he can to impact the game, and just a really fun player to watch and heating up at the right time for Jake as he enters the playoffs. So, I mean, yeah, well positioned, well played this season. Definitely the pivotal trade made there with you, and he's a dangerous team. So watch out.
Yeah, I would say just the final word on Jake's team. I think the biggest X factor for Jake is, can Christian Watson get back on the field? He's way more talented than Romeo Doubs. And if he can really get back on the field healthy and involved in that offense, then I think that this team really has a good shot of winning the whole thing at the end. So let's go to, this would be Charlie's team. So Charlie first, Tom. Charlie gets into the playoffs as the number 6 seed. I hope I'm correct there. So he gets into the playoffs. Let me see if I can find a... Let's see. I'll do this one. So he gets in. Yay, Charlie. Just looking at his squad, just the best players from this week, and maybe someone that's a little bit concerning. James Cook really came on, 10 for 58, 5 for 5, 83 yards to the air, and a touchdown. And then the one little concern here is, also Deebo Samuel, I should mention him probably, carried the ball in for an end zone, and 7 for 9, 149 yards, and a touchdown for Deebo there against Seattle. But the big concerning factor is Keenan Allen is out this week. So he's not going to have Keenan Allen for the first round of the playoffs, wide receiver number 3. I know you're expecting his production to be down based on the quarterback switch there, but definitely someone as talented as he is kind of plug and play no matter what. So definitely hurts Charlie for his first round matchup.
Yeah, it does. And, all season long, we've been talking about the depth on this team and how there just isn't a lot of guys to plug and play in case of injury, right? There's no break glass in case of emergency players on this team. And so he's staring at the possibility of, Elijah Moore, who, at least he does offer a little bit of upside with Joe Flacco, but, projected for just 7 points this coming week. He's got Chigo Okonkwo in there at tight end, a guy that I think was in free agency just very recently. That might have been a recent addition for him. It's going to put the depth to the test this coming week in the first round of the playoffs for him. We'll see if Mahomes is able to do much. That's a tough matchup against New England. And Mahomes has really been, based on draft capital this year, hasn't performed at the level that you expect Pat Mahomes to perform. He's still amazing. He's still a great quarterback, but just kind of down compared to his fantasy expectations coming into the year. We mentioned, I completely overlooked the fact he just picked up Demarcus Robinson, had a great game against the Ravens, has put together a couple nice games that has coincided with the rise of Matthew Stafford here. But a lot of weapons in that offense. So it's just hard to trust this. I mean, you might hit on one or two of these guys, but there might be some really disappointing fantasy performances that could really cost him around in the playoffs. The injury to Keenan Allen obviously is huge. And then, like I see right now, he's got Jordan Addison on the bench. And I think even with Jefferson back, he's got a good matchup at Cincinnati. But then you look at his last 5 games, he hasn't been over 8 fantasy points in his last 5, and that's without Jefferson. So
and
the quarterback
and you have a new quarterback, yep.
Exactly. So I don't know. Lots of options here, but not a whole lot of great options for Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just going to be hard for Charlie. Puts up a good fantasy point total this week, but who does he face this week? He goes against Dustin this week, so the number 3 seed. Definitely a tall task for Charlie, or definitely missing one of his best players against him this week. But let's go over to Tom here. Tom 5-9 with the impressive point total, but obviously at 5-9 does not make the fantasy football playoffs, even with that awesome points for score.
What the hell? Oh my God! No way!
Looking at his team here, just 5-9, definitely not where you want to be, and some disappointing players that you drafted that you thought were going to be much higher than they were. I think leading that list is Davante Adams. Right here, I mean, wide receiver number 21, 67 overall. You're looking for him to be a top 10 wide receiver. Wasn't even close to that this year with that dysfunction in Las Vegas. And also Alexander Madison, you're expecting probably in preseason for him to be a top 15, top 12 kind of running back with the increased volume from Dalvin Cook not being there in Minnesota. Running back number 31 has just been disappointing all year long. Nothing much doing there. And then also, I don't even think he's on his team anymore, or he is on his team. He dropped and then picked him up. Dameon Pierce was just, the hype was huge and just never really came to pass, and actually lost his starting job to Devin Singletary. So just a lot of players.
Fourth round pick.
Yeah, fourth round pick. Didn't really have, these type of players that he really needed to have do well, just didn't really pan out the way that he thought they would. I would say the really nice surprise on the nice pickup was probably Dave Montgomery. Was injured a little bit, but definitely didn't lose that job to Jamar Gibbs, and definitely very impressive when he has been healthy. Running back number 17, and like I said, did miss a few games, so that was a good pick from Tom. But for this week, it all starts with Lamar Jackson, 31 points. He starts him over Stroud. He had a great game, 3 touchdowns, 70 yards on the ground. And just a disappointment here, or the person that didn't do well for this week was Stephon Diggs. You're expecting a shootout there, but only 4 for 11, 24 yards, nothing doing there. And with this loss, Tom is now out of the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, and just to touch on Diggs for a second there, I mean, 3 of his last 4 games under 5 fantasy points. He's gone against some very tough defenses in Denver, the Jets, Kansas City. So, I mean, slow end to the fantasy season for Diggs and a slow end to the fantasy season for Tom. He really had every shot to get in. His point total would have allowed him to get in there. He ends up losing by 4. We had so many close matchups this week, which made for some exciting fantasy storylines this week. He does get the great start from Lamar Jackson, but man, he gets to sit there in Raven Stadium in the rain and watch Isaiah Likely go off on his bench. He instead starts Tucker Kraft for the Packers, who, you wait, you get that Monday night game, juicy matchup against the Giants. He has a fine game, 8 fantasy points, but not nearly enough. And then he also gets to watch his Packers play defense and lose this game to the Giants in dramatic fashion, just 4 fantasy points, with his Cowboys against the Eagles with 11 fantasy points, the Cowboys that have won single-handedly many games for Tom this fantasy season. So just a ton of fantasy storylines for Tom that's just frustrating. And Madison. Look, Madison was having his best game of the year. He was 10 for 66 yards in this game before leaving with an injury. So total frustration all around for Tom. Always a good team in fantasy. Tom typically takes chances on younger players, and found some of those this year. Rashee Rice played really well. Zay Flowers coming on at the end of the year. C.J. Stroud gave him a lot of great fantasy performances, but just not enough at the end of the day to overcome that final hurdle. So Tom will be in the losers bracket in 2023.
Yeah, and what do you think the prop bet was for Alexander Madison not scoring a rushing touchdown through 14 weeks?
Yeah, very surprising, very disappointing. And
I
I've
mean,
got
only
another
3
league,
touchdowns
and
total, but no rushing touchdowns this year thus
yep.
far. So, yeah, just a disappointing year for Tom, and he will look to bounce back next year. But let's go over to. We go over to. Trying to think. Oh, Brian. Let's go to Brian and Dustin. Brian gets into the playoffs with a victory by the the skinniest of margins, going to 7-7, 110.88. Gets in as the 7th seed over Scott by less than 1 point on the tiebreaker. So that just shows you how important scoring points, not just getting wins, but also scoring large points are in this league. Barely gets in. When looking at this week, we always talk about it each week, and he actually did well this week. Breece Hall, 10 for 40, not liking that, but very involved in the passing attack. 8 for 9, 86 yards, and a touchdown for 22 points this week. And then just looking down his board, Josh Downs, is the Josh Downs experiment over? He's been under 7 points in the last 5 weeks. So only scores 4.7 points here, but doesn't need him. Goes to 7-7 and faces against you in the first round of the playoffs.
Yes, he does, for sure. And I was watching that Breece Hall storyline very closely there. So makes you nervous in this one. Jalen Hurts, just 8 fantasy points. Those Eagles are having some issues. Speaking about running backs getting into the end zone, Javonte Williams gets his first rushing touchdown of the year in this one, 16 fantasy points. So nice time for him to start heating up. And the Jets, by the way, are legit. That defensive unit against Houston, 30-6. Are you kidding me? A great start, a great decision to slide the Jets in there.
Stroud did go out of this game.
Right, but I'm just saying the decision to start the Jets, knowing that Tank Dell had been missing, the Jets are really a legitimate defense.
They scored 13 points against Miami, so they're legitimate.
Well, they put together now, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 of the last 9 over 10 fantasy points. So really solid. So it'll definitely be something that concerns me as I get to face off against Brian next week. They do have Miami, so it'll be an interesting battle of offense versus defense in that one for sure. But yeah, Brian, gets into the playoffs as the number 7 seed. Last year would not have made it, but that 7-7 record, we always said that you need to kind of be like a game over 500. But this year, with the extra position and just the big logjam of players kind of of managers around that 500 mark, he gets in as 7-7 squad this year.
Okay, but let's go over to Dustin here. Didn't need a win, already clinched before this week started, so he is now the number 3 seed in the Beltway Wars Invitational Playoffs. So we'll give him a nice round of applause for clinching number 3 seed. Going over his board for this week, I would say Jahmyr Gibbs, 11 carries, 66 yards, and a touchdown. Does a lot with his very limited volume, which kind of scares you, but he's a very talented player for Dustin and the Detroit Lions. And Jamar Chase here was the disappointing player this week. 3 for 4, 29 yards, in a game that they scored 34 points. Jake Browning did look good, but it is kind of questionable. Now is he getting more comfortable in the offense where he's going to spread the ball more around, not just hit the hot read with Jamar Chase. So something I guess you got to be concerned about with Dustin, but you're playing him anyway, so it doesn't really matter. For Dustin, it would be interesting to see what he does at quarterback if he's going to go with Sam Howell this week against the
It's not
Rams,
a good matchup.
Or is he going to go Baker?
But maybe it is
against Green Bay. So
that'd
be interesting. I'm not going to give any advice, just for whoever's. I think it's Charlie who's playing him. Charlie is playing him. I think so. He definitely has a decision to make at quarterback for week 15.
Yeah, and I just clicked off the matchup, but I'm going to go back into it here. Yeah, with a win. So it's interesting, right? With a win, he would have locked up the 2 seed and would be playing Brian again in the first week of the fantasy playoffs. So instead gets Charlie, which, you could make the argument that perhaps Brian's team might be a little bit more potent in terms of just fantasy upside than Charlie's team. But, the chips fell where they may. And he'll look to bounce back and get a win. It's interesting, Gabe Davis. I see now another goose egg for Gabe Davis. He now has 3 of those on the season. It's at literally every other week at this point. Gabe Davis is a goose egg on the scoreboard. So I'd be curious to look back and see how many of those times Gabe Davis was in Dustin's starting lineup, those other 2 games. He was in the lineup here this week and honestly made the difference between winning and losing. So interesting storyline there. The quarterback decision will be kind of a fascinating one to watch. Probably I will, I would say Hal probably has the edge there in that matchup, but we certainly will see what happens. And Jonathan Taylor on IR, he remains doubtful. So any hope of getting Taylor back, even if they got him back, they've got a couple tough matchups for running backs ahead at Tennessee and at Cincinnati. No, sorry. 15 is Pittsburgh, which is a better matchup. So unfortunate that he's not able to get Taylor back for the stretch run. And even if he came back, you would maybe be a little bit cautious in getting him back into the lineup. But regardless, Dustin, number 3 seed, one of his best seasons in the Beltway Wars Invitational, and could make some noise as we go into the playoffs.
Yeah, I would say that his X factor probably, depending on how far he's going to go in the playoffs, is Marquise Brown. If he can get on the same page as he was with Kyler when he came back and get 10 targets, he could be a really nice fantasy option to have. Then you don't have to rely on Gabe Davis where he's going to go boom or bust or not. So I would say Marquise Brown is kind of Dustin's X factor for the playoffs. But let's go over to our last matchup. Yes, that would be our last matchup. And that would be Scott versus Alex. Scott actually pulls this one. I think he was losing for a little bit, but came back here. Goes to 7-7, but barely misses out of the playoffs and is the 8th seed as the Monday night games end.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
So he does not make the playoffs this year, but does go to 7-7. Looking at his squad, some of the best draft picks versus the worst. Michael Pittman, I would say, was probably the best draft pick out of this. Wide receiver number 11 was picked in the 7th round. Really showed that it didn't matter who the quarterback was it Anthony Richardson or Gardner Minshew. Proved to be a very productive player for Scott. The worst was probably Tony Pollard. Just with the expectations, he does end up running back number 10 with a good last few weeks here, but just at the beginning of the season, he's having 6, 7, 6, 7, 5s. Not really what you were expecting for where you drafted him. So I would say that really hurt him. And also Cooper Kupp being out for a significant amount of time this year. Let's see, he missed the first 4 weeks and then he's actually kind of been disappointing too. He's had lulls in production as well, so didn't really help Scott there. But at 7-7, wins his last week. Obviously would like to be in the playoffs, but it's just not in the cards this year.
Yes, and Tom's math was indeed correct. Misses the playoffs by 0.98 points. Brian had just a little bit more in this one, so it was right down to the wire. The other big storyline for this team is the fact that he drafts Aaron Rodgers, and obviously he's been on IR for the entire season. It would be just a really frustrating thing if he does end up coming back and giving you a 1 or 2 nice fantasy performances. I think the odds are against that happening. But
and he also lost Mark Andrews a couple weeks ago as well.
Lost Mark Andrews. That's right. I mean, he goes and gets Russell Wilson, who's serviceable, but at the end of the day, he is the number 14 quarterback, not able to sort of notch up to that kind of QB1 range for Wilson. Pretty consistent this season, but just not good enough. His ceiling was somewhat capped at that 15, 16, 17 point fantasy point range, which just isn't enough to get the job done. And then looking back to the draft board, interesting that I see, he did originally draft Dalton Kincaid, who has, I believe, turned in some really nice performances for your squad, if I'm not mistaken, as the season has gone on. So not having the patience to keep Dalton Kincaid, you end up having to start a guy like Gerald Everett, who's fine, but Kincaid certainly would have given this team the needed boost had he sort of been a little bit more patient with Kincaid throughout the year.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unfortunate timing, I think. And, he didn't have Isaiah Pacheco in this one. Maybe he scores more than 5 points against, that Zach Charbonnet scored. So maybe he scores more there than he gets in the playoffs. Just kind of unfortunate. And his whole season was basically ruined by injuries at the wrong time. So Scott goes to 7-7, and it is the 8th seed in the losers bracket for this year. But let's go over to our last team, our favorite team to talk about this year. That would be Alex, ending his season, his woeful season at 3-11.
You failed!
And like most of his season, he goes into this one with a loss, 95.24 points. Does avoid the shotgun, but does end his season with a loss. Going over his roster, best and worst, Bijan Robinson was probably his best pick, which is kind of shocking. Is running back number 9, but probably wasn't used to his full potential in that offense that he should have. Only gets 10 carries in this one in a very competitive matchup. So wasn't used to what he should have been, but was his best player. And the worst pick, I mean, you can Josh Jacobs, T. Higgins, George Pickens. I mean, any one of these guys really. Trevor Lawrence, really disappointed this year, and definitely weren't even close to what their ADP said prior to the season. So just a really disappointing season for Alex, and I'm sure that he is glad that he doesn't have to look at this really anymore.
Yeah, I think that probably started to set in a couple of weeks ago. I mean, look, the Vikings are your top scorer this week. That says it all. I mean, just rough performance, a goose egg on the board, an injury to Josh Jacobs. So just all around kind of a deflating way to end the season. Jacobs and Robinson ended up being fairly good for their 1 and 2 picks. They weren't, the best running backs in the league, but they were definitely top 12 for each of them. So just a season to forget for Alex. I think he'll look to bounce back next year. And I think did avoid being the lowest scorer. That title does go to Josh this year on the points scored at the end of the year. But
we should have had a punishment for the lowest scoring of the season. But alas,
probably a little late.
But 3-11, his pain is finally over, and his team can rest in peace. But let's go over to what everyone's been waiting for. Going over some of the playoff matchups here. Very interesting matchups in the. Go ahead.
I don't think the loser bracket teams have been waiting for this. They'll probably tune out.
You can tune out now, because we're not going to be talking about your teams for probably the rest of the season.
Everyone only listens to their own team anyway.
Yeah, our viewership's going to go from 10 to 6 now because now there's 4 teams out.
7.
Yeah.
We're 2 of them, so.
Yeah, I know.
5.
But let's look at some of these matchups here. Anyone you want to start with? You want to start with yours? We'll go 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll go down the list.
Sure.
Okay. So let's start with it would be the number 2 seed versus the number 7 seed. That would be the Blue Crabs versus the Thundercats. See,
There you go. There you go.
The projections are pretty close here. You were projected to win 115.48 to 108.32. But let's look down the matchups here. You have Matthew Stafford against Washington. That's a good matchup. Jalen Hurts against Seattle on Monday night, so you're going to be real stressing about that. That's interesting there. Aaron Jones remains to be seen if he's going to be playing this week against Tampa Bay. Breece Hall against Miami might be a shootout. Who knows? Saquon Barkley against New Orleans. Not the greatest matchup, but he's their really only skill player there in New York. Javonte Williams against Detroit on Saturday. So that'll be interesting to see there. CeeDee Lamb against Buffalo. At Buffalo's, and the little weather thing says very windy here for CeeDee Lamb, so that'll be interesting to see there. Devontae Smith, Monday night, the double with Jalen Hurts against Seattle. Josh Downs against Pittsburgh. Calvin Ridley at versus Baltimore on Sunday.
You're bouncing back between. I think we should just focus on, because it's hard to tell
time.
if you don't know these teams, who's.
Well, I
do
have it on the screen.
Oh, okay. I'm not watching the screen. Yeah. Okay.
But okay, we'll just go with your team. So Metcalf, you have a Philly. Hockenson against the Bengals, which you like. James Conner against San Fran. That's a hard matchup. And then the kicker and defense. Defense you probably like against Arizona, so that's good. For right now, though, very interesting here is two players. You're not starting Jaylen Warren, and you're not starting Tua Tagovailoa. What's your thought process behind those two not playing for Matthew Stafford and Aaron Jones?
I mean, we just talked about how the Jets have performed in recent weeks. Eight out of the last 9, over 10 in fantasy points. So honestly, it's not even a question at this point. I stuck Stafford in there. Everything I've listened to in the last day or two about kind of fantasy matchups on the podcast and everything, it's a no-brainer for me. I think Stafford has been hot. That Washington defense is among the worst, if not the worst, in the league against quarterbacks, against wide receivers. They sold, some of their really good defensive players mid-season to some contending teams. So love that matchup. Love the Metcalf matchup. The running backs is going to be the pivotal kind of make or break part of the equation here. Aaron Jones, hopefully will be back. Thought I would get him back last week. Would have liked to kind of have him involved in the offense prior to inserting him right in for the fantasy matchup. So he gets a tough matchup against Tampa Bay. At least for now, I do like the upside of him more than Jaylen Warren. Warren has struggled in recent weeks. He's got 3 straight under 7 fantasy points. So a little bit tough to trust there, despite the good matchup at Indianapolis. So, I mean, the X factor for me is going to be Nico Collins and his health. He's got a great matchup against the Tennessee Titans, a team that typically give up a lot of points to wide receivers. He's the number 12 fantasy receiver. So would love that matchup a lot better than Calvin Ridley versus Baltimore. So that, to me, is going to be kind of the storylines that I'm watching here as this week gets underway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, looking at your squad, looking at your squad versus Brian, because I know you're not going to make a prediction, but I will. I would say that your squad's the more talented team and probably has the better matchups this week. Just looking at it, you have Breece Hall versus Aaron Jones is probably a wash if he does play. Saquon against Javonte Williams, that's Saquon. Devontae Smith versus CeeDee Lamb, that's CD. Josh Downs, Terry McLaurin. These are players that have kind of been even Travis Kelce against TJ Hockenson. I mean, that's a toss-up, really. So I do like your team to pull out the victory in this one. But it all comes down to, for Brian, Jalen Hurts. How many tush pushes can he get in the end zone? Because if he gets 2 rushing touchdowns, this game could be a lot closer than even I think.
I mean, that really, if you're looking at these two teams, Jalen Hurts, that matchup, and Metcalf on the other side, there was some reporting that I think I don't know how true it is, that some Eagles player said that Metcalf is kind of a hothead, and if they can get him ejected or get him that's kind of an interesting thing to watch on Monday Night Football. So the Hurts versus Metcalf Monday night, just as you said, will be really fascinating to watch for sure. And he's got Devontae Smith. Yeah. So that a lot will be riding on that Monday night game. Travis Kelce, the kind of the interesting thing, you mentioned him versus Hockenson. The New England Patriots have been one of the best teams against tight ends. And Kelce, the number one overall tight end here. But he's sort of lacked those big games. He's consistently, as of late, kind of between 10 and 12 fantasy points. Hasn't kind of gone over that number since week 7 against the Chargers when he had 29. So kind of limited upside lately, which is surprising. Yeah. We're used to seeing 2 and 3 some games for Kelce. So I don't know, kind of an interesting. New England, as I said, has been good for sure there. I mean, I guess Hurts has struggled recently. Is there any, maybe he hasn't struggled from a fantasy perspective. The Dallas game, you kind of chalk that up to Dallas's defense. Is there any thought that you would give into potentially starting Brock Purdy over Jalen Hurts, or is it a wash, or do you just kind of rely on?
I didn't even see
that's
that.
A tough call. It's a tough call. I wouldn't want to make it if I was him. I'll just say that.
Oh my God. Yeah, I don't know.
Very tough.
It's definitely in the conversation. It's definitely a conversation. I mean, if it was me, I'd probably go Hurts just because of the rushing. You're going to need a big points out of your quarterback. And I think he's more likely to get in the end zone 1 or 2 times. But yeah, it's definitely close, 49 to 51% who you're going to start. Brock Purdy's in the MVP conversation. You don't just take those kind of considerations lightly when picking a quarterback to start, especially in a playoff. Yeah.
The flex decision is going to be a big decision here. It's kind of like what we were saying with Charlie's team, that there's not a whole lot of great options. Kareem Hunt is there against Chicago. He's questionable. Didn't practice on Wednesday, so that could potentially be a guy that you would start in that spot. But if he misses this game, you certainly obviously can't do that. He's got Tajay Spears penciled in right now, a guy that's performed really well recently, but his upside is just really capped by the fact that Derrick Henry continues. This is something we've been talking about all year. Henry's workload, just when you think he might be slipping and Tajay Spears might be kind of gaining more favor in that offense, he struggles. And so that decision of who to start in the flex, could ultimately play a big role in winning or losing this week.
Yeah, there's so many question marks, right? Because, if Pacheco doesn't play, do you start Clyde Edwards-Helaire? Khalil Herbert's not getting any really work here. Dallas Goedert, I think that's too bold. Started your flex, so yeah, definitely a decision to be made for Brian, but definitely an uphill battle. But crazy things have happened in the fantasy playoffs, so anything can happen in the matchup. But let's go over to the number 3 seed versus the number 6 seed. That'd be Dustin versus Charlie, or the Ocean Pines Octopi. This is why I don't say the fucking names, because I can't never pronounce anything. Versus the Rockstars. Right now it says 114.62 to 100.07. So the projections really favor Dustin. Just looking at, there's everyone's in. So just took out Keenan Allen. Yeah, so Keenan Allen's not in. He is starting. Oh, Robinson over Keenan Allen. Okay. So there it is. That's
what we said. We said Allen is. Do we say he's out? Right? Because it's a Thursday game. He's ruled out. Yeah. Yep.
So, but he put in Demarcus Robinson to start for him.
Yeah, which I like. By the way, that's a matchup against the Commanders. We just talked about how they're one of the they're awful against wide receivers. They can be picked apart from the defensive end. So I like that pickup a lot for Charlie. If there's an upside guy, I think he's one of the better kind of pickups this week, and inserting him, I like it.
Okay, so let's go through the rest of Charlie's players here. Patrick Mahomes against New England, that's a scary, scary matchup, I would say. Especially how bad that offense has been recently against a tough defense on the road. And it looks like there might be even some weather there, so definitely scary there. You have Derrick Henry against Houston, James Cook against Dallas, which is also not a great matchup. Deebo Samuel against Arizona, you like that matchup. Robinson against Washington, just like we said, you like that matchup. Jacoby Myers on Thursday night against the Chargers, you'd like that matchup in the Dome. Ngakoue against Houston, probably like that, but he's the only tight end you have on the roster, so you're definitely playing him. Elijah Moore, as we were talking about, in the flex spot against Chicago, with Joe Flacco finding him the ball early and often. It will be interesting to see if Amari Cooper plays in this one. If he doesn't, then Elijah Moore is definitely a must start. And then you have Kansas City's defense against New England. That's a really good matchup. New England's offense is pretty bad. So with that, anything you see here that you would that's kind of questionable or might surprise in terms of his starting lineup? Because 100-point production or projection is not very good, especially your first round playoffs.
Yeah, we talked about Addison earlier. If Jefferson does end up missing this game, which I'm not exactly sure what his status looks like now. I think just the upside for Addison, I know he's been bad, but I think you probably, knowing that you are the weaker team in this matchup, you probably have to go with the upside of Addison versus maybe a guy like, I don't know, Jacoby Myers. But you're going to have to make that call very quickly. Jacoby Myers has been very hit or miss recently, so I don't know. Again, there's not a whole lot of decisions to be made because there's just not a lot of guys on this bench. Roschon Johnson, you're not considering. Royce Freeman, you're not considering. Justin Watson, maybe he's somewhat interesting, but not really. Khalil Shakir, no. So it's just kind of all these middling wide receivers that you're deciding on, and I don't know that I like any of them more than the others, except for Robinson. Like I said, that's a high upside play there with Stafford playing the way he's playing. But other than that, not a whole lot.
All right, but let's go over to Dustin here. As we were talking about with his squad, goes with Sam Howell, at least penciled in right now, against the Rams. That's going to be at Rams, so very interesting there, going over Baker Mayfield with Sam Howell. Jahmyr Gibbs against Denver. You have Kyrie Williams against Washington. Love that matchup. You have Jamar Chase against Minnesota. Jalen Waddle against New York. Tough matchup there. But if Tyreek doesn't play, definitely huge upside for Jalen Waddle. Puka Nacua against Washington. Also a great matchup. Kyle Pitts, he has penciled in against Carolina. Not really getting a better matchup than that. Marquise Brown, like I mentioned before, he's penciled in at the flex spot against San Francisco. And then you have Miami against the Jets offense, which the Jets offense has been better recently. So maybe not so much upside there in terms of points scored. But like I said, doesn't go with Baker here. Doesn't go with Gabe Davis, as we saw last week. He went with Gabe Davis. And Taysom Hill is also riding the bench. So maybe Dustin's just trying to kind of play it safe here against a weaker opponent. Have a high floor in terms of, not scoring goose eggs with Gabe Davis or Taysom Hill. Just getting solid production out of each and every spot on his roster.
Yeah. Not a whole lot of decisions to make here, I don't think. You mentioned Kyle Pitts. He doesn't have another tight end. That matchup against Carolina is actually... Oh, he does have Taysom Hill. Oh, and he does have Cade Otton. So, yeah, I don't know. Taysom Hill, that would be a huge high-risk, high-reward play. I guess it's okay to stay safe with Kyle Pitts. Carolina actually does happen to be one of the better teams in terms of preventing production from tight ends.
That's because everyone else scores against them. Just not tight ends.
Well, that's true. That's generally true. The running backs especially, I think. But, in a matchup, week one this year, in that divisional matchup, Pitts was 2 for 3 for 44 yards against those Panthers. So a little bit concerned about that matchup, but where I'm not concerned, there is juicy, like steak, 10-ounce ribeye, 12-ounce ribeye. I guess ribeyes are even bigger than that. So like 16-ounce ribeye, who knows? But Sam Howell against the Rams, we just saw what Lamar Jackson was able to do in the rain against this Rams defense. Jahmyr Gibbs versus Denver. Their defense has gotten a lot better, but not against the run. They still remain one of the easiest teams to run against. Give up a lot of production in the passing game, but against the run, they hold off. They're a bad team to pass against, but a good team to run against. Kyren Williams in that same game with Sam Howell on the opposite sideline against that Washington defense that we've already talked about. And in that same game, Puka Nacua against the Washington defense. So that's a very important game for sure. If you want to watch the Rams-Commanders game, which doesn't sound very sexy, that is one that Dustin will certainly be paying attention to. And frankly, I think we're going to know pretty early in the week on Sunday who's going to win. There's not a lot of drama in this one. All of Charlie's players will be done, at least the starters that are in there right now. They'll all be done by the time Sunday Night Football comes around. So not a lot of drama in this one, I think, and probably give the edge to Dustin just based on those really great matchups that he's got.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Just the matchups, looking from Charlie to Dustin, the matchups are night and day. I mean, Charlie has some really bad matchups. James Cook against Dallas, Patrick Mahomes against New England. And Dustin has some great matchups here. Anytime you see a running back with 16 points projected, it's going to be a good day. So I probably do give the edge to Dustin here in the first round of the playoffs.
Yeah, we should say the Dolphins defense might be a little bit of an X factor here. They've been really good lately. They've had 4 straight games over 11 fantasy points. They have the Jets and their kind of terrible offensive situation going on there. So projected for 11 points. That's a home game for the Dolphins. They really need a win, so their defense will be fired up. So I think that could be a nice double-digit defensive point scorer for Dustin this week.
But let's look at the most interesting probably matchup of this week, and that would be the 7-7s versus the 7-7 teams against each other. That would be the Countrymen versus the Creep Show, Mike and Jake. Really, really close projections. Jake is barely ahead, 117.04 to 115.23. Let's start with Jake's squad. Here, Dak Prescott against Buffalo. That's a good matchup. Christian McCaffrey is matchup proof, but he does have Arizona. Rachaad White against Green Bay. Good matchup. Mike Evans versus Green Bay. It's a fine matchup. Chris Olave versus the Giants. Good matchup. Romeo Doubs, who he has in right now, against Tampa Bay. That's a fine matchup. Cole Kmet against Cleveland. That's a hard matchup, so not good there. Zach Moss against Pittsburgh. Also a very hard matchup. And then he has, the kicker and Indianapolis defense against Pittsburgh. Looking at his bench, some of the things, he's not starting Odell, at least right now. He's not starting Najee Harris. And Christian Watson, he misses Wednesday's practice. So is it too bold to go Odell over Romeo Doubs for this week?
Well, decisions here, right? Because you got to also factor in Christian Watson if he plays against Tampa Bay.
Well, it said he missed practice this week. Or he missed practice on Thursday or Wednesday with a hamstring.
Hamstring, yeah. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see how he'll need to practice in the next couple days to return. So, it's definitely a question. I mean, you've also got Najee Harris potentially there as a potential flex. The decision between Moss and Harris, or do you slide Beckham in that slot? So definitely some decisions kind of around the periphery for Jake this week. And just as we said that Dustin's going to be really focused in on that matchup with the Rams and the Commanders, that is the case this week for Jake's Green Bay Packers against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Of course, starting the tandem Bucs superstars Rachaad White and Mike Evans against those Packers, and then the potential of Dobbs in there, or Watson, or somebody else. Of course, the Packers in that game against Tampa. So kind of some interesting things to look for. McCaffrey, that juicy matchup at Arizona. You rarely see kind of a non-quarterback projected for 20 fantasy points, but that is exactly where McCaffrey is projected in this one at Arizona in the Dome. So Chris Olave, questionable. I think he's probably trending toward playing in this one. He's had a really nice string of fantasy production in the last 5 weeks. He's over 10 fantasy points in each of those games. His snap percentage has been down, probably due to some of the injury concerns that he's had recently. But hey, the New York Giants, that's talk about another one like Washington. That is another really great matchup for wide receivers. So some good stuff, kind of a mixed bag. The quarterback matchup there for Prescott at Buffalo. I don't know how great that is. It seems a little bit middle of the road. It's at Buffalo, probably going to be cold. Buffalo all of a sudden sniffing that division, potentially taking that division from the Dolphins, so they may be extra motivated to take down one of the monsters like Dak Prescott and the Cowboys. So definitely a couple decisions, interesting things to watch here. And then just the storyline of Jake versus Mike, two teams that have gone in completely different directions this season. Mike started out hot and faded because of injuries. Jake made that trade midseason and all of a sudden has shot up the standings. And then all the injuries that Mike has. So definitely, I agree with you. The most interesting matchup of week 1 of the fantasy playoffs.
Well, and, interesting said, let's go over to Mike's team. Do you think they're going to be watching this game closely with Josh Allen versus Dak Prescott at 425? Awesome. So, Josh Allen, obviously matchup proof, but doesn't have a great matchup against Dallas. But is at home, so probably a little better to be at home than away. Travis Etienne injured, but also had a bad matchup against Baltimore. But we did see Kyren Williams rush for over 100 yards against Baltimore last Sunday, so maybe not as run stout as they used to be. Devin Achane against New York. You can run on New York. The Jets, as they've seen in the past, he played against the Jets, I'm pretty sure. He didn't, but Mostert did, and he had a good game. So definitely can run on the Jets. Zay Jones against Baltimore, like I said, not a great matchup in terms of the passing attack. DJ Moore against Cleveland, not a great matchup either, but it's probably really the only option there in Chicago. Justin Jefferson, that's the big one. He was limited on Wednesday, so that's good for Mike that he was able to get in a limited practice Wednesday. Probably trends him to playing this week. Dalton Schultz against Tennessee. That's a fine matchup. Ezekiel Elliott against Kansas City. He is really hoping that Ramondre Stevenson does not play this week so he can get the full potential out of Ezekiel Elliott. And then you got Atlanta against Carolina. That's the best defensive matchup you can probably get for a starting defense. Looking at his bench, nothing really to talk about. I don't even think there's really any decisions here. You're not starting any of these players over anyone that's in the starting roster as of now. It just, with Mike, as the whole season has been, are these players going to be able to play? I mean, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questionables here. Looks like everyone did practice. Achane did not practice on Wednesday with a toe. So interesting there. Zay Jones limited. He practiced. DJ Moore missed Wednesday. So yeah, I mean, if he can get all these players to play and suit up on Sunday, it's definitely going to be a very close matchup. But if one of these two or one or two of these players don't, it could be a landslide victory for Jake.
Yeah, it certainly could be. The line on that Bills-Dallas game, by the way, is 50.5. So, that's 25 points per team. So it really will be a fascinating one. I've said fascinating a lot tonight, and there are a lot of interesting things to look out for. I mean, that I totally didn't even pick up on that Prescott and Allen were facing each other. It's interesting too that he could go all in and stick the Bills defense in there. You wouldn't do that, but he does have the Bills. If he did want to go all in against those Cowboys and Prescott, he could start that Bills defense. I don't think you possibly could. But some of the matchups do concern me in addition to the injury concerns. Travis Etienne, I think that Rams game was just weird against the Ravens. We watch this team week in and week out. We know how solid this defense is and can be against even really good teams. They face some decent running backs this year and have done a really nice job. That tandem of linebackers, Queen and Roquan, have just been deadly, plugging gaps against really elite talent. So that matchup concerns me. You've got Zay Jones currently slotted to play the Ravens as well. You've got DJ Moore at Cleveland, which is one of the really tough matchups for wide receivers. So that one scares me a bit. The only decision too that maybe it's not a decision. Dalton Schultz will be returning. That matchup against the Titans is actually a little bit tricky. You certainly like his upside with Tank Dell being out, with the potential of Nico Collins being out. But Logan Thomas, not that you can trust him because he's been very bad, but the Rams, we just saw what Isaiah Likely did against that Rams team. They looked really leaky against the tight end and have had a string of bad performances against tight ends in recent weeks. So not that you would make that call. I think if Schultz plays, and it looks like he will, that's the right call to make. But it wouldn't surprise me if Logan Thomas outperforms him there.
All right, so who is your pick out of this? I want you to pick.
Boy, it's really, really tough. If I had to say right now, just seeing the number of questionable tags on Mike's side of the ledger and just the trajectory of these two teams, I think I would give the nod to Jake in a close one. You think about it, if any of these 4 elite players, plus Zay Jones and Brian Robinson, if any number of those guys don't play, you're all of a sudden having to dig into this bench, which, just like we've talked about with several other teams, is really lacking. So I'm going to assume a couple of those guys miss this game, and Jake gets the edge for me.
I'm going to reverse what you said, and I think most of these, if not all of these players, are going to play this week, and Mike is going to get the victory in shocking fashion. So we will have a little bit of rooting interest there, just based on predictions, just to see who will come out on top. And whoever comes out on top in this matchup will play me in the second round. So I'll definitely be very interested to see who wins this one in the first round of the playoffs. But that is our show. That is all the matchups we're going to go over for the playoffs. Probably next week we're going to do a little bit differently. We're probably going to we're going to recap them, then go over the next week as well. We're only going to be doing winter bracket stuff. Sorry, losers. Yeah, we're only going to be doing that. So they're going to be a little shorter, but we're going to continue doing this until the championship matchup in a couple weeks. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for having a good regular season, and I hope that we have an exciting playoffs. So, bye, everybody.
See ya.
If you enjoyed the show, please remember to like and subscribe on YouTube and Spotify.